Let me give you a little bit of background why I do the work that I do today. My old man was an unemployed Italian immigrant steelworker. If anybody here is old enough to remember the crash of the steel industry in the 70s in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and all across the Rust Belt, our family was a victim of that. Now, as a kid, I would hear my father come home and bemoan at the dinner table about the practices that were going on in his workplace. Literally, his boss, the manager, would tell him to slow down because he was making the boss look bad because he was throwing off the measured piecemeal rate by his work pace. Now, if you went back and opened the newspaper for the 70s in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, what you would have seen is headlines that said cheap foreign imports from Japan. And the accusation was that Japanese labor was flooding the American marketplace, allowing inappropriate competition. Now, if you juxtapose that against what my father was saying, and in historical context, I've had the ability to research this, something else was actually going on. There were a set of researchers in the United States that had started to think about new ways of manufacturing and working. They were people whose names you may or may not know. Certainly you know Drucker, but you may not know Deming, Duran, and others. And they were studying something called total quality management. TQM, what some of us know as Six Sigma today, continuous process improvement. It was being studied in the United States, but it was ignored by the American steel industry. All of a sudden, though, the Japanese got a hold of these principles of constant refinement and perfection of a work process, and they adopted them. And yes, as a result of that, they were able to deliver cheap and higher quality foreign imports, which crashed the steel industry. Now keep that in the back of your head for a moment because it's going to be relevant to my career trajectory. But as a kid, I'm sitting there hearing my dad bemoan everything that we're suffering, unemployed. My dad was busting his ass, trying to make ends meet, taking any job possible, ditch digging, you name it, everything. My mom had to go get a job as a cleaning lady, which she hated. And I'll mention in a moment what job I had to go get to contribute to the family as well. But what was most important then was there was something born in this young man, myself, through a contract with my dad and I. Someday, I would grow up and now you're gonna laugh, I would be governor of Pennsylvania and then president of the United States, and I would fix American manufacturing. At the age of 10, that was my mission. I would grow up and fix American manufacturing through political route. I didn't know any better in terms of what would be the appropriate route to change the economic state of families. That's what underlied my core belief. Now, my old man found out that there was a local country club. I grew up in Pittsburgh. The local country club where we lived is called Latrobe, Pennsylvania. And I went and got a job as a caddy. One of the most extraordinary jobs you could possibly have. You're outdoors for 20 bucks a day. I carried golf clubs, met interesting people, and I made the same amount of money my mom was making on her knees scrubbing floors. Now the difference is that I would go up there and literally I would sit for 5 days, sometimes get out once, right? So it wasn't quite the same ROI in terms of my time, but it was meaningful to my family if I could bring back that 20 bucks. So my old man said something to me. He said, Keith, this is my first day. He's like, show up at the golf course a half an hour early. And I'm like, Pop, I don't think there's anybody there. And then he repeated himself. Show up at the golf course half an hour. When my dad repeated himself, I knew I didn't have a shot. I called it immigrant Tourette's. He would just blurt shit out. I wouldn't understand it, but I would be like, okay, fine. I'll show up at the golf course half an hour early. You're driving, so why not? So I'm up there and I'm walking around the golf course and I noticed things. I literally was by myself. And I noticed things. If you're not a golfer, I'll try to translate this. I noticed where the pins were placed because they change them every day. And if it was a blind shot, I could tell my golfer no, you don't need an 8 iron, you need a 9 because the pin's at the front of the green. Or I would notice whether or not the greens were cut that morning so I knew that they'd be faster. So I noticed things. Plus, I had this drive and ambition, and I needed the job, and so I had hustle. Now, this is important because one day, my fate changed. I had a lady. Her name was Mrs. Poland. Mrs. Poland was the best golfer in the country club, except for Arnie Palmer, who owned the country club. And she played every single day, and she had me as her caddy. It was just a random pool. And I caddied for her. And at the end of the time, she said, Keith, would you caddy for me tomorrow? Like, wow, big deal. So I go up there, caddy for the next day. Same thing at the end of the caddy session. How about the next day? Absolutely. So by the third time I'm caddying for her, she started asking me questions of a personal nature that made me very uncomfortable. Now, this is not a Mrs. Robinson story. We're not going there. Questions like, what do you want to do with your life? Now, that was not a question I was prepared to answer because I was terrified. My old man had gotten me into a small private elementary school on a full scholarship. I tell this story in Never Eat Alone. And I got bullied, made fun of because of the clothes that I had, the car that we drove, beat up green Nova with rust spots. My dad's hands, he could never get them clean. There'd always be like dirt in the, even though he'd scrub them with gasoline, right? And kids would make fun of that. Carpools, someone bring me home, they'd say, oh, one of the girls in the room, oh, we're going down into the hole, which was because we lived out in the country and we had to back a dirt alley. Mrs. Poland represented something scary to me. Wealth was scary to me because the kids of wealth were scary to me. And all I wanted to do was keep my head down and do the job and get my $20 and bring it home to my family, right? This becomes really important. I have 2 foster children, and both of my boys are of color. And I often understand from their perspective, sometimes they just want to keep their head down and not lift their heads up and engage with people that to them are other, that they're afraid won't engage with them in the way that they would want to be engaged with. And I can reflect back on a day when I felt the same way. But Mrs. Poland dragged it out of me. She literally said, damn it, Keith, what do you want to do with your life? And I said, well, you're going to laugh. It's funny. I just said that a second ago, too. I still think that in the back of my head. I said, you're going to laugh, but my dad says if I work hard, study hard, get good grades, I can do anything. That's why we came to the United States. You know, an American-born kid can do anything. I could be president of the United States someday. And she didn't laugh, and she looked at me, and she says, yes, you could. She said, I would vote for you. 2 weeks later, I show up to caddy for Mrs. Poland. Now we're caddying every day. And she had the local congressman in her foursome, Jim Murtha. And she had told this man that I was a good kid, told about my aspirations, and suggested that it would be fun to have him give me some coaching and advice. Well, not only did he give me coaching advice like you should get into speech and debate, you might want to get into theater because you really should feel comfortable, you know, in front of people on stage. You can use my library, which was in Greensburg, anytime you want to study. And he took me under his wing. Because of that man, I did win national speech and debate in high school. And I did get a full scholarship to Yale University, which would have never been possible. Both he and Mrs. Poland provided those doors, those opening of doors. Now, the important part of that story is one that I'm going to reverse a little bit and ask you a question, which is, why in the heck did Mrs. Poland do that? Why do you think? Why did Mrs. Poland go so far as to do that? Any thoughts? Yeah. And she did. She came back from the wrong side of the track. She had married in to a very wealthy local family. But yes, that's true. Yeah.
She saw potential.
She saw potential in me She saw this young, driven, charismatic. I wasn't that charismatic, actually. I was pretty shy, keep my head down. But anyway, she saw potential, right? I think that's true. Any other thoughts? Yes, sir.
You created 30 minutes earlier.
I think somebody's heard my talk before. The answer, well, I asked her the question. She's still alive. I see her when I go home to see my mom. I asked her the question, Mrs. Poland, why did you do that? She said, Keith, you took 2 strokes off my golf score. Why is this a meaningful lesson for the rest of my life, and I hope for everybody in this room, as a starting point on our journey and this dialogue today? And it's this. Between now and whatever you want out of your life, the mission you want to achieve, the prosperity that you hope to achieve for yourself, for your family, for your children, for your community, for your cause, there are a handful of people critical to opening doors, to giving acceleration, strapping a booster rocket on every dream you've ever had. And their willingness to pay attention to you is the tipping point of whether you show up a half of an hour early at the golf course for them. Hope that sinks in. When I wrote Never Eat Alone, I think what it changed, humbly, I think we changed the trajectory, Tal Raz and I, who wrote that book, we changed the trajectory of how people thought of relationships and networking. They were no longer something that you just had to use or transact or amass, but it was something that you gave to, invested in, shared, loved, authentic, vulnerable. And that through those real relationships, which start with generosity, I will bust my ass to be of service to you. And that opens doors. And then as soon as the door opened, then you slide right in with beautiful authenticity so that the relationship solidifies. Because clearly opening doors through generosity sounds transactional. I get it, it is. Because individuals have a lot going on. And if you don't open the door through, in a sense, what's in it for them, all the crazy monkey mind that may be going on won't be attended. But if all of a sudden you open the door with generosity, with a hope of, because I'm present, you will get something, and then you slide right back into saying, and who are you? And who am I? Right? That relationship builds bonding to move forward on. Does that all make sense? So powerful, so simple. And it's what I built my life on. The important thing to this, for me, and literally when I say I built my life on it, I have. There's a lot here I'm not going to get into. You might want to take a picture of it or just go online and see one of my talks that are just about this book. What I thought I would do today is something I've never done before. It's a little intimidating, and I don't know if I can do it in an hour, which is now probably 45 minutes. But I'm going to take you on a journey with me that is what I have wanted to give to the world through my books and through my teachings, but at the same time give you a little behind the curtain peek of what I was struggling with and what I had to learn in order to be able to take the next step to give you what I want to give you. And so that's that kind of, at the same time, talk a little bit about how my mission has meandered around, but actually as I've written this, it hasn't meandered as much as I thought. So the point of this book and my lesson to you and my awakening is you need a relationship action plan. Just like you need a financial plan or to-do list, you need a relationship action plan. For every goal you have in your life, I want you to list the names of the 3 people that will most help you achieve those. And I want you to be conscious of the fact that those are 3 individuals that you have to serve richly and deeply and recognize with abundance, not a balance sheet. It's not about giving and keeping score. It's about giving and knowing that the world will and the universe will promise take care of you. And of course, if somebody isn't abundant in their giving back to you, you're welcome to move on to another relationship. I'm not suggesting you be a doormat, but I am suggesting that you're not an individual that walks up to somebody and says, so let me tell you what I'm giving you and let me tell you what I expect. Which, believe it or not, is what most people think of when they think of relationships and networking. But there's a lot more that came to fruition when I was thinking about this book, but that's the lesson I wanted to sink right here. Now, what happened to me is this mission of wanting to be president of the United States, wanting to change American manufacturing, it took a pivot, interestingly enough. And it was born from, there was no question, what was born in this, in my gut, was scarcity and fear. We were poor. And I never wanted to feel that again. And fear, and scarcity that I didn't think I would be able to. And I frankly felt broken. The abundance of going to a rich school and being a poor kid is so beautiful, but the negative side of that is I didn't feel like I deserved to be in the room. Now, I went to Yale. I ran for city council in New Haven. At the time, because I was Yaley, and my old man, who was a Democrat, said to me, if you're going to Yale, you're going to be a Republican. And I said, why, Pop? We've always been Democrats. He goes, because Republicans are rich. I'm like, all right. So I went to Yale, which is not a Republican school, and I was the chairman of the political union of the Republican Party. And because there's only two of us, they asked me to run for city council in New Haven, Connecticut. So I did. Got picked up in the New York Times, got national coverage, and people started calling me from back in Pennsylvania, wealthy individuals like Elsie Hillman and others, to say, come back when you're done with Yale. We want you to run. So I did. Left Yale, found a district that I thought I could win in Congress, and something happened that threw a curveball for me. I fell in love with a fraternity brother. That was not a Republican way. In fact, it wasn't a political way. It wasn't a way. Back in those days, Liberace was straight. There was no role model. Anything that I told you I've never given this talk, not quite. Anything that I hoped for myself, I saw no path to be my authentic self. The only time in my life I've ever contemplated suicide was sitting in my bedroom with my scrapbook of all the elections that I had won and the things that I had done politically, and me working for George Bush Sr. when he was vice president, and pictures of me in the White House at the podium pretending to give a talk as president, and giving that up. But I saw a pivot. I could maybe materialize my vision, save American manufacturing, but maybe I could be a businessman. And maybe I could be authentic to myself, but just not tell anybody. Whereas I felt if I were to do that in politics, it would just be too difficult. So I went to Harvard Business School, but I had no money. Guess who funded my tuition to Harvard Business School? Mrs. Hillman and all of the people who were prepared to invest in my congressional election. The people that you robustly serve and then show up as an authentic, lovely human, they'll always be there for you, no matter where your mission in life goes. It wasn't the same mission, but it was a new mission, and the people were on the journey with me. So I went to Harvard Business School, got out, and decided to go to a company called Deloitte, exercising all of the belief systems that I had learned and taught in this book. Hadn't been written yet, but this is what I was fomenting. The CEO of Deloitte stood in front of an audience of interns, which is what I was at the time, and said, someday Deloitte will be one of the top consultancies in the world, at par with McKinsey and Accenture. At the time it was called Anderson Consulting. And I sat in the back of the room and I was like, we're the lowest of the big 8 right now. And I went up to him afterward and I said, sir, I'm committed to your mission. Remember this conversation, if you would. I'm going to come back to you in a few weeks. Well, I went and I did a research project. Remember, lead with generosity. I went and I called a professor of mine and I said, hey, let's do a project. What we're going to do is I'm going to study professional services marketing. And I'm going to interview the chief marketing officer of McKinsey, chief marketing officer of Accenture. I'm going to interview all of them, and I'm going to put together a playbook for how an organization can become the top in professional services. And the professor said, great, let's do that. And I did it. And I told everybody, candidly, I said I was inspired by working at Deloitte, and I'd love, and I will give you the research. I was like playing a little mini Gartner group, right? I was like, I'll give you the research if you give me the information. But of course, who did I send it to? The CEO of Deloitte. 2 weeks later, I got an invitation to come down to New York to sit with him. He's blown away. He said, nobody's ever stepped out of the way and did that. Your playbook is extraordinary. I was an intern, remember? He goes, I want you to come into the firm. Back in my head, I'm like, frankly, I think I should go to McKinsey. Because I actually had an interview with McKinsey, and he somehow knew that, which was creepy, and said, do you think anybody at McKinsey knows who you are? I'm your CEO, and I want you to come. And I looked at Pat, and I said, Pat, I'd love to, under 2 conditions. The first condition is that the rest of the time that I'm here, you'll give me 1 dinner once a year, just you and me. And the second thing I asked for was more money, and he said no. But he gave me the dinner, and he made me, within a few years, the youngest partner ever elected in the firm and chief marketing officer of the company before I was 30, worldwide for Deloitte. You find the individuals that are your path to opportunity and success, and you invest in them deeply and richly. And then you follow with authenticity. He became like a second father to me. I was closeted. I was in a beautiful relationship with a wonderful soul named Roel, who in the workplace became my girlfriend, Renee. And I felt like I had to leave Deloitte. And Pat, God bless him, early on, I was sitting with him at dinner one time. I said, Pat, what would you do if you found out that there was a partner about to become partner, and you found out he was gay? Remember, this is in the mid-90s, something. He said, well, that's easy. Figure out a reason not to make him partner. That's not Deloitte today. I was like, all right, good, note to self. Well, I left Deloitte to go to Starwood Hotels with a young, ambitious, driven guy named Barry Sternlicht running the company, who had a much more liberal point of view. And in that exit, I went to Pat, and I said, Pat, he really was like a father to me. I said, Pat, I've got something I need to share with you. He goes, you're gay. And I'm like, yeah. How long have you known? He goes, I've known for a while. By the way, he never remembered the comment that he made. He goes, I've known for a while. I figured you'd tell me when you're ready. Well, it gave me courage to be more of my authentic self in that process. But in the process of moving all of these lessons forward, I never lost track of that core mission. At Deloitte, I started Deloitte Research, which was intended to develop methodologies which would start with the methodology of total quality management and emerge that to higher productivity in workplace beyond just manufacturing. I started something in Chicago where I was living at the time called the Lincoln Foundation for Business Excellence, because I had become a Baldrige judge around total quality management, and I thought I would use the platform of Deloitte to create an award to help organizations accelerate in adopting these new tools that the Japanese had adopted. So I continued to keep my mission focused, and I felt really centered and authentic to what I was doing, even though I wasn't fully authentic to who I was along that journey. Now, I ultimately left Starwood, and it gave me an opportunity to think what was next. Concurrently, somebody wrote to me and said, Keith, I'm writing an article for Inc. magazine, and it's about people who've had disproportionate success at a young age. I'd like to interview you. And I said, sure, but again, be thoughtful and be generous to people who could be important to you. I sat back and I spent hours thinking, what do I have to share with this journalist in advance? I didn't want to be lazy. And I walked in and I gave him 10 tips of how I was successful. And he looked at this, went back and talked to his editor. I didn't know this. He came back to me and said, you know what? I don't want to interview you. We've decided we want the article to be you. You've just written it for us. They published the article in Inc. magazine, 10 tips of a master networker, which disgusted me. But it provided an opportunity for a publisher to call me and say, Keith, you should write a book. And I said, I've just started a firm, Ferrazzi Greenlight. I don't know that I really have time to do this. We'll give you $250,000. I will find time. I wrote Never Eat Alone, and it catapulted me into an entirely different place in the start of my company. Now, what was very interesting about this, and I'll just pause, remember the scarcity mindset, the fear, the insecurity, still there, deeply. My earliest tools that I had in life to escape and to be a seeker were prayer. I was brought up in a strong religious background with my mom, and I believe very strongly in spirituality, and prayer was my place. But unfortunately, what I was praying for as a young man was, please God, take this away from me. And it was along the way that my seekerdom finally opened up the opportunity. I wish I had found it earlier, but I approached a priest in the Anglican church and asked a question about my sexuality, my shame. And he didn't greet me with shame, he greeted me with love. And then he encouraged me to see a therapist, which I wish, I used to walk by the therapy place at Yale, wishing that I had the courage to walk in there at the time, all 4 years as I was going to class. But it wasn't until afterward, and it wasn't until I was a private individual that I could pay privately, even though I still had shame, my therapy. And then somebody mentioned this thing called meditation. And the idea was you could sit for 10 days and maybe discover something about yourself. It's called Vipassana. And it was one of the greatest door openings and gifts that I could ever possibly have in my life. And on day 7, I realized that I have everything that I need inside of myself. And it was one of the most beautiful experiences I've ever had in my life, and I highly recommend it for anybody in this room. Now, with all of this going on, I started this firm. I now have this book, but what was interesting is I shunned the book. The book was about networking. I had made a commitment that I was going to reinvent American manufacturing, American industry. I was going to work with the titans of the largest corporations of the world and make sure that the preservation of the jobs in those organizations, the hundreds and thousands and the millions of people, would be my contribution to the world. I didn't have time for a book about networking. I actually turned my back on it. So many of you in this room, I've already had the blessing of some of you coming up to me in the back of the room says, your book changed my life. And I didn't internalize that. I was aiming at a different thing, and I couldn't think of the congruence of them at the time. Now, along the way, by the way, let me just give you a couple of tips here. The biggest thing I learned about building networks is that networking is exhausting. The kid who wrote Never Eat Alone was running around like a one-armed paper hanger, wallpaper hanger, networking everywhere. And there's no question, if you read that book, you will smell scarcity. The tips are extraordinary. The practices are extraordinary. They allowed me to crush it in business and in life. But it's a lot. The elegance that I learned in retrospect, looking back, is there's a much more powerful way to network, and it's called building community. The simple path to that, and it's what Alex has done here. In anything that you want to achieve in this world, be the host of a beautiful community of other people who are looking to achieve it. And then that community will be your networkers. They will recruit more members, and they will allow individuals to come together, and I created a word for this, to co-elevate. Being the host of a co-elevating community is the most elegant, emotionally rich way to build the richness of the network that you need. Not to say that all of the things that I wrote about aren't valuable and important and useful, but the big takeaway in retrospect is each of you building a community, which, by the way, in my research institute, which we formed, I took from the learnings of Deloitte Research, took those into Ferrazzi Greenlight Research Institute. In our research institute, when the pandemic hit, I had recognized that this was a glorious opportunity to think about the reinvention of the future of work. I had been on that trail since 2010, and I'd been studying hybrid work since 2010, funded by a couple $1 million from people like Accenture and Cisco and others. And all of a sudden, here we were with the most beautiful laboratory of the future of work. And I decided to start a community of other people who were committed to never going back to work. We would only go forward to work. And it was the Go Forward to Work research community. In that period of time, we published 30 or so articles in Harvard Business Review, Forbes, Fortune, Fast Company, Inc., etc. We had hundreds and hundreds, thousands of individuals co-creating research and insights online. And that research institute has become one of the most beautiful things that I've been able and inspired to continue to lead and grow and looking to manifest even more and more and more. But it was the awakening that it wasn't me running around networking and selling out of scarcity and fear, but instead it was me being calm and humble and hosting a community that I could serve. Yeah. Now, what happened along the way is I wrote another book. This idea of broad networking and bringing as many people into your life and opportunity as possible made me ask the question, what about those few deep relationships? How do they look? Because the intimacy, one of the things that was created within me as a young man was an intimacy disorder. It was a sense of aloneness. My folks were of a different people. They would never accept me for who I was if I had come out to them. My dad was equally economically scarce. I love that exercise. That meditation just took me right back to the economic scarcity that still exists in me today, but was clear to me as a child, and the anger that existed between my mother and father over money and the belief of money and all of that was born in me, and the only way out of it was for me to create my own damn nepotism. I had to divorce my family in my head as a kid and go create my own nepotism through paternal relationships like Pat LeConto at Deloitte and others, and I had to create my own family because my family weren't the family that I wished I'd been born into. And it was a very lonely exercise. And it's very similar to my sons, two of whom were in at least 20 homes before they came into our home in their teen years. You get an emotional severance from intimacy. And so I was good at the network. I was not good at the intimacy. And I started studying it. That's a wonderful gift of being a writer, which is anytime you realize you need to learn something, decide to write a book about it. And for me, that's literally how I do it. And that's why my books can take so long. I can take 10 years to write a book because it takes me that long to really get it. And so this book was the beginning of that journey of trying to get it in intimacy and connection. And this is where I realized that, and our research showed that the 3 deepest relationships in your life are the most predictive of your success, not just your network. Because they're what feeds who you are and your authentic self and your monkey mind and your scarcity versus abundance and your sense of of authenticity. It's all born from those tight relationships in your life. And I didn't know how to build them. As I spun ahead, I started to study the other aspects of relationships. Not just the intimate ones, not just the broad ones, but the productive ones. And I realized that we were waking up in a world where getting anything done, remember, get things done, David, what's his name? David Allen, yeah. I realized getting things done wasn't about lists, it was about people. And I realized that leadership really was more about goals that you had in your life and your ability to create networks, which with Who's Got Your Back made me realize that if I really wanted to achieve, it was my ability to co-create with extraordinary people. So I realized if I wanted to be in this world of being on stage and being of service to people, who do I need to get to know? I need to get to know Tony Robbins and Deepak Chopra. Those are the two people that came up to my mind. And I was like, okay, they're on my list. They're on my relationship action plan, right? Peter Diamandis, who wrote an amazing book, Abundance, and is one of the great, beautiful futurists, on my list. And over the years, I've been able to lead that group of individuals. I serve Tony in his sessions and helping him move from what he does beautifully in his stage presence to thinking about how do you really create intimate community within what he creates, and Peter the same way. And so we worked as peers and buddies in our co-creation of what we're trying to serve in the world. And the reason I point that out is while I bring this book to corporations and say, if you're a chief information officer, for you to lead digital transformation, it has nothing to do with IT. It has to do with your ability to lead your peers with humility, to invite your peers into a co-creation of a mission. The first person you invite into your team, you're inviting them into their team. You're not on a pedestal, you're actually serving them. And that ability of leadership to rethink leadership as networks, right? That's become a really important part of our work. The other thing that's been a really important part of our work is studying those high-performing teams. For 20 years now, we coach teams. And coaching teams, and we do have the blessing, and I'll say, we've had the blessing of being of service, and this is something we've written up, so I'm not belying any confidences. We had the blessing when General Motors was coming out of bankruptcy. I was on a stage like this in front of 2,000 of the top leaders, and that was a big deal to me because my old man was a UAW steelworker. And being on stage, I called to action this group and I said, listen, for us to not just pay off the TARP money, but to thrive, we're going to have to do it in pods of individuals who have each other's back. And to co-create not just with the manufacturer, but with the dealerships who clearly are pissed off at us and we have animus relationships with. So how can we really have lifeline relationships with people that we need to serve the transformation of General Motors? And so the good news was that was picked up by the president, who invited us in to a multi-year journey to reinvent the co-creative culture of General Motors using our intellectual property. And when the CFO of General Motors, years later, pulled me aside at a meeting, he said, Keith, I want to tell you something. Your work was one of the 3 reasons we didn't go back into bankruptcy. And I got in the car on the way home and I just gushed in tears. My old man was passed away by then. Yeah, he knew. I believe that he knew. But I wish I would have been able to get him on the phone with the CFO of General Motors. Where I am today is there's a new mission. And the mission that I have in life today is to recognize my first book, Never Eat Alone, the theme was you can't get there alone. You need other people. And today I realize you need to host a beautiful set of souls who collectively can achieve disproportionately extraordinary things. And that's a unique form of leadership. It's a unique way to fulfill a mission. And it's so different from the scarcity that I was born from and the insecurity that thinks that I have to do it myself. The belief in partnership and the knowledge of intimacy of how to get out of your own way so that you can approach partnership I haven't shared much about my personal life along the way, but I had 2 marriages to 2 amazing men. And my intimacy disorder came to light in those relationships. I was one man in my books and my stage presence, but my drive and my mission and my scarcity and my fear to achieve left behind the attentiveness that I should have been for love. Didn't really think about love. And to be honest with you, I didn't think I deserved it. I didn't think I deserved it because the thing in my brain that said broken, even though I authentically appreciated who I am as a gay man, I still felt broken. The tape was playing. And as a father, and I had 2 foster children at the time, and I always joke that the gays are put in this planet to take care of the ones you straights don't. I now consider myself a proud papa of 6 boys. And the turning point for me out of desperation was plant medicine. I had heard about this thing called ayahuasca. And I was like, I'm not going to find love. That's just not me. I'm not hardwired for that. And I'm not a good person. There's still that shame that it was underlying. There was nothing, there were certainly things in my behavior that I could point to reinforce that I'm not a good person. But on the big picture things, I don't know why I could diagnose that. But I would constantly, that's what I would see. And through what Austin showed you in brain chemistry re-engineering and hardwiring, I started to find a different path. The one thing I knew for myself is I wasn't going to get married again until I could love myself and know that I would love the next person like they deserved to be loved, was my holding out for an 8-year period. But if it wasn't for the work that I did with ayahuasca and psilocybin through journeys, highly curated by professionals. I do not believe that this is something that should be taken lightly, that shouldn't be something you should joyride over. It's not a recreational substance. It's a healing tool that needs to be curated. But it made me open to love and to a new sense of purpose and partnership. In 2020, I swiped right for the last time in my life. And I'm in love today in a way that I'm so blessed. If I think about the big things that have been my seeker opportunities, prayer in the most nascent stages, Vipassana, coaching and therapy, Tony Robbins conferences, Al-Anon, by the way, the Dalai Lama said years ago, God's greatest gift to humanity was the 12 steps. If any of you have not studied the big book of the 12 steps, it's one of the most extraordinary paths to personal recovery that any of us could follow. When I wrote Who's Got Your Back, I found it because I was looking for peer groups that were supportive of each other to the point of transformation. I found it in Weight Watchers, I found it in YPO forums, I found it in AA. And I studied and went to Al-Anon and discovered the power of a group of people who wouldn't let each other fail. And it was one of the most beautiful awakenings. If I look at all of the little pivots of seekerdom that I had, and then no question, plant medicine. But I'll have to tell you what right now is my greatest healing journey. It's my love. And I didn't think about that until I saw, heard some of the early presentations. I realized the reason that even plant medicine right now may not be calling me as much as it was before was because I've got the most beautiful healing energy. I don't want to let that man down. I want to be the man that is in this relationship that honors the person I'm in love with. I've got so much work to do. Seriously. I mean, maybe that's my scarcity mind speaking. I think probably the greatest achievement that's next for me is real acceptance. Not acceptance of my sexuality, but acceptance of what I've got. Right? I mean, that financial exercise, that beautiful sitting, meditating, what do you think of when you think of finance? I think of failure. When I think of money, I think of failure. Because I think of what I didn't make that I should have, the mistakes that I've made, the companies that I've launched that I've lost, the millions of dollars, the tens of millions of dollars, the hundreds of millions I've made, and how much I've retained of that. I think of failure. Failure. That's work I got to do. By the way, if there's anybody out here who coaches specifically to that, please grab me afterward. And that's the other thing that I've also learned. I've learned that every one of you in here, you have to live your life full of coaches. You don't have to pay them, but you have to find them, and you have to serve them. And you have to have them for all aspects of your life, for your intimate relationships, for your goals and aspirations, for your being a better chief operating officer and being a better chief executive officer and being a better chief marketing officer, because all of us entrepreneurs know that we're all of those things, right? We need to find our mentors and our coaches, and we need to serve them, and we need to create community. This is a big one. I just put it out there to you. My conflict avoidance has always been, how many people in this room have a difficult with conflict and candor? Raise your hands. Oh, beautiful. Thank you for that. Goosebumps. This has got to be on the top of your list. It's the greatest freedom that you can give yourself when you can give yourself candor, transparency, when you can give yourself the honoring of your own voice. And it's one of the most powerful things that I highly recommend that we focus on. And I find that the ability to create a social contract with your teams and with your coaches, and you get practice with being fully honest and transparent, is the greatest freedom that's happened for me along in my life. And it's at the core of this belief system that I have called co-elevation. And co-elevation is what we teach executive teams to achieve. By the way, what's my number? 10. 10, great, thank you. And it's what we teach executive teams to believe. And I'll share with you, let me go back. The contract of a group of people committed deeply to achieving a mission, but also deeply committed to lifting each other up while achieving that mission. That's the principle of co-elevation. We're committed to a mission, and we're committed to each other. That means that we will not withhold the truth. We will not be conflict avoidant. We will share with each other what we're feeling. As a leader, leadership is not about you giving feedback. Leadership goes one step further, your ability to get your team to give each other feedback. That's mind-blowing. Think about that. The co-elevation leadership, I believe fundamentally we need to move from leadership as the focus, and we need to move to teamship as the focus. And that's what I've been bringing to Fortune 100s, CHROs. And I sit with those executive teams, the CEO and the executive team, for them to realize that just because there's 3 different divisions, they are not sitting in the room, but they are sitting in the room with an enterprise goal, and they are each other's feedback. For entrepreneurs, it will free up 30% of your time. But for large enterprises, it will find a set of co-elevating coaches in the room that will allow you to accelerate innovation, boldness, extraordinary. And these are the attributes, which I got into in more detail, and the data that we have. What I've loved is the rigor that I've been able to bring to our organization. I sell our research not as an output, but as an input. I'll go to a company like Google and say, collectively, we should research the future of hybrid work, or collectively, we should research how AI is going to impact team efficacy. And then they will fund my research as a co-creation, because they're committed to they're co-elevating with me. And it's a beautiful model because I'm a small firm, but it allows us to have, I'll take a topic and we'll get $2 to $5 million of investment from large brands to co-create cracking the code of that. And with that, I've been able to bring in a community of extraordinary thought leaders. So our data is extraordinary, and it ends up being a profit center for us at the same time, right? And that's something that I'm really focused on right now, is this sense of shared partnership and research institute. And it allowed us in literally less than 2 years during the pandemic to do the largest data set of 2,000 teams and how they were reinventing work during the pandemic that created this book, Competing in the New World of Work. It was published by Harvard. Now, I've spent a lot of time, let me give you a little thumbnail before I end with a story that I think is meaningful. This is a model that we created because I believe, if you look back, we're now in the third wave of the reinvention of work. The 70s opened our eyes to the importance of total quality management. By the way, not created by HR, but created by manufacturing out of necessity for quality improvement. The next wave was Agile. Agile was created by necessity by engineering organizations, and the reality is that every one of our organizations today needs to operate under an Agile operating system. Not just project management, not just operations. Every company needs to be operating on Agile from top to bottom. And I'm writing about one of my clients, IBM. Arvind, the CEO, uses Agile from the very top of the organization. Why? Because he was born in engineering. And it's allowing them to outstrip other organizations' success in their segments. And this includes AI, et cetera. But here's what's coming down the pike. What's happening right now is world-class digital reinvention of work in a digital format. Has not actually happened. What you did during the pandemic is you changed where you work, not how. You took your boardroom meetings and you moved them into Zoom, and now you've moved them back in the boardroom. We're focusing on policy, because that's what HR does, not practices and process. The world-class hybrid teams were born and suckled on the Google stack at Stanford. These are kids that started their businesses out of Stanford, unicorn, fast growth companies, and they don't collaborate in meetings. Meetings are not the primary form of collaboration. There's an entire digital way of collaborating that most organizations, in fact, only 15% of companies are in levels 4 or 5. We're at a level of, level 4 and 5. 85% of organizations are struggling down at 1 and 2. We're right now on the cusp of the reinvention of work, of white collar work, and people aren't even curious enough. We're still battling whether we should be 2 or 5 days in the office. So this is where my heart is right now, and it's a new wave of what I started when I was a kid looking at TQM. Now, I loved that Austin had this. I wasn't going to do this, but I will send you, there's a couple of articles my team have teed up around the hybrid ways of work that we've written in just recently in Forbes and in Harvard Business Review. This also offers to take a diagnostic test for high-performing teams that we've created. And it also asks if you want a conversation with one of our people, which I don't expect to be a commercial thing, but if you want to engage with me, you can do that through this. Because who knows, out of here I might find new partner opportunities to work with and co-create with. Let me end with this. So that's my mom. Right after Never Alone came out, I was out on the speaker circuit a lot. And my mom called me and she said, "Keith, I was watching you on the YouTube. And I noticed something. You talk a lot about your dad." And I said, I'm sorry. That's right. But I'm writing a book right now about peer groups that don't let each other fail. And Mom, I remember something growing up that maybe you can help me with. And that something was, my mom had a group of ladies that used to meet at our house once every couple of months. And I asked Mom, I said, "Tell me about that group of ladies. How meaningful was that group?" She said, "Oh, you mean the card club girls." So the card club girls, I found out, have been playing cards every month for 55 years. They had never once skipped a card playing. And then they would just rotate. So when it was time for my mom to host, the only thing I knew was that Dad and I were kicked out of the house, which was cool for Dad and I, but I had no idea what was going on. So mom would sit there with these ladies playing cards. And I said, Mom, how meaningful was that group to you? And she said, well, when your aunt died, we didn't cancel the card game 3 days before she passed. We went to her bedside and we sat on her bed, and she said, she was still conscious, she said she didn't want to cancel the card game. She wanted to play cards one last time with the girls. When your dad was unemployed, those ladies cooked extra every day. And when your dad was out looking for work, I'd call them and they would slip down and give us the food so that Dad wouldn't think we were taking charity, but he'd think we were able to stretch a nickel. Because back then, unemployment insurance had run out, we had no money, and the government was only offering at that point something called welfare cheese. And she said, we didn't have to eat welfare cheese. And she said, when your dad died, the girls made sure that I got out of the house every day for months until I was ready to get out of the house myself. There's only 3 of them left now. My mom's crushing it at 90, by the way. She says that, she jokes, she says, every time one of us dies, we have to change the card game. She says one of these days, there'll be one of us sitting there playing solitaire, thinking about the others. When I wrote this book, the first thing, I was so relieved living on the other side of the country from Pittsburgh. I was so relieved that my mom had this. And all my life, she's had this. She's had a group that has had her back all her life. And then at the time that I was writing this book, I realized I didn't. It was at the time when I was in a relationship that wasn't the love of my life. It was a time that I wasn't being the leader that anywhere could create this kind of an ethos in the workplace. That was a while ago, and it was a long journey. And I have to say that the journey is, I wish that I could say all the stuff, the formula, the stuff I've been giving you. What was going through my head today for you was, okay, what was my mission when? What was my mission when? What had I achieved using the tools that I had, and how could I communicate those tools to you for your benefit? What was I really struggling with? And not just the business tools, but what were the life tools, my seeker tools that I was using to get myself ready for the next level that I could then bring to the world? That was my thinking about this talk as I was conceiving it for you. And in one regard, the scarcity of me feels exhausted. Like, fuck. Been working so hard to catch up to the person I'd like to someday be, That's the scarcity mind. Remember I said my big job right now is acceptance? The acceptance of I'm already there, right? That one would say, what a blessing. When I wrote Never Eat Alone, I could not have done what I'm doing right now for you, with you. We're co-creating this for sure. I would have been up here trying to impress. I bet there was still some of that in this talk too. But that's okay, right? It's okay that I can still recognize my crazy head and that it's all good. So going forward, it's about acceptance. Probably the most powerful tool that I could use going forward is love. And probably the biggest thing that I've got to crack the code of now is partnership, right? Just learning those muscles on partnership and trust that will create the biggest footprint. I always used to think that God put us on this planet to maximize. I'm a maximizer, definitely. Activator, maximizer. And God put us on this planet to make the biggest footprint possible by the time we move out of this planet. And I'm sure some of that's beautifully healthy and some of that's beautiful scarcity. But my big footprint will probably come with a lighter ripple. And it might make a bigger impact. And I'm just still on the edge of learning that. Thank you. Thank you.